Congratulations on finishing the reading quiz, and hopefully going through the syllabus was also a good exercise, just to make sure we're comfortable with some of the policies, like the late work policy. I stick to that one, like strictly, right? Pretty strictly. You got to let me know if there's special circumstances. Otherwise, everybody slips up a little bit. If you just slip up by a couple of days, it's not going to hurt you that bad. As you slip up by, a few days, it's going to hurt you a little bit more, but still you can recover from it. As long as you turn it in, I'll give you at least half credit, even if it's over a week late. But I think every assignment, every week that we cover is really important. I'm a sociology nerd, so I don't want anybody to skip a week. So do the work every week. I always recommend that everybody budget at least 3 to 6 hours for this course every week, right? Like if you were in a traditional seated section, we'd meet 3 times a week for an hour, or twice a week for an hour and a half. So we'd spend 3 hours a week in a classroom, and then you'd have readings and stuff to do outside of class as well. So if you're budgeting 3 to 6 hours a week, it's going to be plenty of time, and you're going to do great in this class. So this video is edited through Edpuzzle, so it's going to pause periodically and ask you some questions just to make sure you're staying engaged and that you're not just, putting me on play and then going off and playing Fortnite or whatever it is that you do. So that's it. So that's the interactive portion of it. I try to make it feel a little bit like a real classroom experience, where I sort of ask questions and you get a chance to respond. But anyway, so that's where we're at. So we're going to forge right ahead. We're going to look at the first part of chapter 1. We're not going to go all the way through it this time. We'll get more into the theoretical perspectives next week. But those are really important. And so I want to spend more time on those next week, because that's going to help us organize a lot of the information that we gain from here on out. So we're going to spend some more time studying that conflict theory, structural functionalism versus functionalism, and symbolic interactionism. We're going to talk more about those next week, but for right now, we just want to hammer out this idea of the sociological perspective and the sociological imagination, which are obviously really similar, but we'll try to separate those, right? So sort of make them distinct ideas in our heads. So that's what we're looking at with this video. So one of the things that I miss the most about teaching in an online format and not in an actual classroom is day one, getting to ask my students what their preconceived thoughts about what the heck sociology actually is anyway. Because I hear all sorts of crazy things, like it's the study of society, which it's in the name. Yeah, so yeah, well we want to get a little more specific than that. I hear it's the study of people, but I'm like, well, yeah, technically, but any social science or humanity is a study of people. So right away, even, and I think probably there's this period where if you're in like a sociology graduate program, you're still having trouble defining what sociology actually is. It's like you know it when you see it, but it's hard to actually put into terms because sociology is such a large subject that encompasses so many different aspects of our life. So let's try to demystify this word sociology a little bit and bring it down to earth and see what it is we're actually talking about. So I love memes, and I love memes because a lot of times they're and just these humorous little images that you see floating around the internet or being texted to you from your friends. There's often some pretty valid sociological observation that's in there. Like this one, which just cracks me up because it's always one of the first examples we talk about in a sociology class of a pattern of behavior that you don't necessarily recognize in the moment, but you realize that when you get on an elevator, there's rules for how you behave when you're on an elevator with a stranger. You're not supposed to make eye contact. You're not supposed to stand too close to them. If you're making conversation, it's got to be very general. You're talking about the weather or something very benign or harmless. You don't sit down on an elevator. You don't face the corner when you're on an elevator. You don't fart when you're on an elevator, right? Or if you, or at least you don't fart loudly, right? You try your best to hold that in. There's rules about how you behave when you're on an elevator, depending on the situation you're in. The rules of how you're supposed to act change, and that's all. And that's what the sociological perspective is. It's about trying to recognize those patterns where behavioral expectations change depending on the situation, right? It's about recognizing patterns. And that's the key word that we're looking for, and the key thing that we're looking for. The key idea is that we're recognizing patterns of interaction. So let's break this down a little bit more. Let's do a little brain surgery on some of the terms and definitions that we have in the textbook. So this is where we get our our definition of sociology, right? The scientific study of social behavior and social institutions. And we gotta unpack that a little bit, right? There's a whole lot that's packed into that statement, right? There's so much there. So let's first start with this idea of the social environment, right? Right? It's the people, the culture, the institutions with which a person interacts, and that's one of the key words, right? The word interact. So when we look at this definition of sociology, the key words are scientific and social. So let's put a pin in that word interact, and we'll come back to that, because first we want to look at this word scientific, right? Scientific, I think we kind of know what it means, but let's be really clear about it. We're talking about a systematic, a methodical approach to studying something, right? Scientific, right? We've all heard of this scientific method, right? We all know about the scientific method, and that was brought in the textbook reading as well. Something becomes a science when there's a specific system or a way of studying it that you're really trying to get at some sort of objective truth about what's going on. You're examining it in a very prescribed, very methodical, systematic way. That's science. So we're scientifically studying the social things. So let's look at that word social, and that's where we get that word interact, right? Anytime we see the word social, that means we're looking at something that has an interactional quality, right? And interactional means that just more than one person is involved. At least two people are involved. For something to be social, you just need more than one person to be involved. That's what we call the social moment. When more than one person begin to interact, that is a social moment. That's where sociology begins. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that two or more people have to be present at the same time, right? So just like when you're getting ready in the morning, or when you're getting ready to leave at any time of day, you're getting ready to leave your house or your room, and you're looking at yourself in your mirror, and you're getting yourself fixed up, right? That is still very much an interactional action, right? It's that activity has to do, and the decisions that you're making and the things that you're doing in that moment are very much influenced by the people that you're going to see, the places that you're going to go. Are you going to work? Are you going to school? Are you seeing someone who you might have a romantic interest in? Are you seeing someone who you really don't care, or someone who's are you going to see somebody else's parents or some other authority figure that you want to make a good impression on? All of those things are impacting the decisions that you make when you're looking at yourself in the mirror and you're getting yourself ready to leave your private space. So even though you're not actually present with anybody in that moment, that activity of getting yourself ready and looking at yourself in the mirror is very much an interactional activity. So it's very much a social activity. Now, anybody can sort of recognize patterns of behavior, right? I mean, it's something that a lot of stand-up comedians are really good at. They sort of see patterns of behavior, and they can sort of make it funny, make very normal, mundane things seem weird and odd when you describe it in a certain way, and you never really maybe thought about that interaction objectively, right? It's just something that you do, some of the patterns of behavior, things that we do that we never really thought about. It's really easy to recognize those patterns. The tricky part in making it sociology is when you combine those observations, observing those social patterns with scientific inquiry. And that'll be week after next when we get into methods, and we're going to look more at when these social observations become science, is when we put real, actual scientific methods to collecting and analyzing social data. And there's a lot of different ways we do that, but that's the key, right? Just because you're observing some social pattern doesn't necessarily make you a sociologist. It's when you put scientific methods to observing those social patterns, that's where real sociology begins. Now, at this point, you might be pausing to ask yourself that, I'm not really interested in becoming like a true sociologist, right? So what do I hope to gain from this class? Because I don't really necessarily recommend any of you go on and like try to go to grad school in sociology. Maybe, but look, just it's hard out there to find jobs in sociology. Trust me. So the question is, what do we hope in an introduction to sociology class? What do we hope our students gain? And that is, and that's where we're getting into this idea of the sociological perspective, right? The sociological perspective just shows that we want to think about, not necessarily even systematically and scientifically study, but that we at least can recognize and think about all of the things that might influence our behavior and the behavior of other people. That social forces, and again, we're gonna talk about this term social forces more. But there are these external forces, social forces, that affect how we behave and affect how we act and affect what we think. So the book uses this really like provocative phrase, right? That's meant to provoke you and try to get some sort of reaction, emotional reaction, some sort of charged reaction, where it says, "Are Americans really as free as we think?" And I mean, come on, like again, this book is far from perfect. But that's just a way of expressing that, yeah, no, of course. Like, we're not like totally free to act however we want, whenever we want. There are definitely rules to how we act in certain places, right? I got to tell you, I enjoy, I admit it, I enjoy drinking a beer. I enjoy going to a bar and drinking a beer. In the pandemic, I haven't been able to do it. When I go to a bar and drink a beer, I use a lot of cuss words, right? In this class, when I'm talking to you guys, I'm not going to use a lot of cuss words, right? So look, the sociological perspective is just recognizing this idea that the social environment has a real effect on the way you act and the way you behave. And it's not just recognizing that, but just being able to look into it and pull back the layers on it, right? Going beyond the most obvious observations like, yeah, I cuss in a bar, but not in the classroom, right? Like going beyond those most obvious explanations and observations and digging in and just trying to see if we can figure out a little bit of truth that isn't so obvious at first glance, right? We're going to look at how we come to some certain conclusions about people and about the way they interact that we didn't know before. And so that's what we're looking to obtain with the sociological perspective. We're looking at trying to be able to recognize that there are these larger social patterns that have a real effect on the way we act and the way we behave. Now, one of the key terms that we're going to beat to death in this class is this idea of structure, social structure. And that is where we are looking at these social patterns that affect our behavior, right? So a social pattern becomes a social structure, right? We recognize these patterns of behavior, and they become a social structure when they become really ingrained, right? When they become really ingrained and have a observable, demonstrable effect that's able to be demonstrated through some sort of empirical research, some sort of scientific study. You can demonstrate that there is this pattern that exists that has effects on individuals. When it becomes something that you can really point to and look at and see the evidence of, then it becomes a social structure. So social structures are these social arrangements that shape behavior. But that's what we're going to be spending a lot of our time talking about in this class, is these social structures. But there's also something called agency that in an introductory level class we don't talk about as much, but is also equally important, right? So social structure are these patterns, these social patterns, these ideas, these social facts and social forces that influence our decision making, our individual ability to do what we want when we want to do it. Those exist, but there also exists agency, right? And that is the ability to act independently of structure, the ability to navigate these social structures so you can achieve the goals you want and the ends you want and do the things that you want to do. Agency and structure are both important. There used to be, and this is really old-fashioned now, right? But there used to be this structure versus agency debate, right? Like how much of human interaction and human action in general is dictated by their own individual agency, and how much of their interaction is dictated by the social structures and the social environments around them. And it was this stupid and pathetic academic debate. That's like the nature and nurture thing, right? You're familiar with the idea like nature versus nurture. It's really similar, right? Nature is the idea that you're born certain ways, that genetics makes up most of who you are. And then there's the nurture side, which is the environment and the way you're brought up and the way you're raised makes up most of who you are. And again, both of these debates are just stupid because it's enough to say that both matter, right? Your genetic code matters, right? And it's worthy of study. The way you're raised, your upbringing, your environment and journey through childhood also matters. It has a big effect on who you end up becoming. Nature matters, nurture matters. Debating on which one matters more is just pointless and stupid and just something for academic types to do to waste their time, right? It's ridiculous. Both matter. Both are worthy of being studied. Same with structure and agency. The social structures that affect our decision making and affect who we are and what we can and when we can do what we want to do, when we want to do it. Those things matter, and they're worthy of being studied. Our own individual ability to navigate those social structures and where that comes from also matters and is worthy of being studied, right? So in our class, I just got to put this caveat in here because it's a big one. We're going to talk so much about social structures and these social arrangements that shape our behavior. That doesn't mean that we're just like these little pin cushions where social facts are just poking us and prodding us and shaping us into whatever they want us to be, right? We're more than that. Human individuals, we are complex creatures, and we have all sorts of abilities to determine our own ends, regardless of what our background is. So while we are going to spend most of our time talking about these external forces, the social structures, know that I'm saying it now, and I want it to be clear all semester, that who you are on the inside matters just as much as all these things on the outside that are affecting you and your behavior. There, all right, I'm off my soapbox. And the last thing I want to talk about with this video for this week is the sociological imagination. And like I said, we will cover more what was in chapter 1 next week. We will have a new reading, but we won't move on to chapter 2 yet. We'll have a new reading next week, but we'll get to it. I do want us to real quickly just go over the sociological imagination and how it relates to this idea of levels of analysis, or the macro and the micro, as the book talks about it. So let's get into this idea of the sociological imagination, which is really similar to the sociological perspective, but it's a little bit different, right? The sociological imagination, I think, is a little bit more specific. So the sociological imagination, it comes from this guy named C. Wright Mills, where he said that it's the ability to connect personal troubles and public issues, right? So, for example, the book uses the idea of unemployment, and of course, it makes sense. Being unemployed is definitely a personal problem. That's something that affects individuals, right? But it's connected to larger social patterns, right? The economy is a social structure, right? And don't tell the economists this. I mean, they know it, but they don't often think about it. the economy is a social structure. The economy is a huge, deeply ingrained pattern of individual and group interactions, right? It is a social construction. We'll talk about more what social constructs are. But anyway, it's a social structure, right? That's the economy. So this social structure that is the economy, that is this grand amalgamation of all these little micro level interactions, becomes this large level social structure that has a huge impact on individual lives. How many jobs are being added? If you work in the manufacturing business, you've seen your jobs erode slowly and sometimes quickly over years and years and years. I used to live in the mountains in coal country, and these old coal mining towns are all suffering because larger social patterns have dictated that we are moving away from coal as the primary source of energy in our country and in the world and in our society. So there aren't as many jobs in coal, whereas 100 years ago, coal was it, man. So these towns were built around the coal industry. People who grew up with coal mining ingrained in their upbringing and in their culture are now seeing that old coal mining town change. And there's maybe not a whole lot they can do about it. So that presents very personal troubles, right? But what's causing those personal troubles, what's at least having an effect on those personal troubles, are public issues that are way beyond their control. So that's where we get C. Wright Mills, and there's the guy. He looks like a typical dude from the 1950s, and he was. But he said that the sociological imagination enables us to grasp history and biography and the relations within the two. Again, let's unpack that a little bit, right? So we're talking about history, which is large level social, these large level social patterns, and biography. The story of my life has been affected by larger level social patterns. I'm going to tell you my age. I was 18 years old on September 11th, 2001. I was in my first semester of college. I was a couple weeks into college. And that had a huge impact. There wasn't much as me as an 18-year-old could have done with that, but so much changed with the way we consumed media, the way we interacted. So much changed on that day. So that history, that's social history, the history of society and of our country, changed so much that day, and it also had an effect on us as individuals. And so the sociological imagination is recognizing the connection between these huge patterns and our individual lives. So again, it's a reciprocal thing too, right? So that's the point of this next quote, is that you've got to understand the context, the historical context, to understand any one person's life, right? In the 1980s, women wore shoulder pads in all their dresses, right? I don't know. Well, never mind. That might be a little bit of a dated reference, but styles change. That's the point I'm making, right? It's hard to understand how people interacted in the 60s and 70s when you see what they're wearing. They may look ridiculous to us now, right? Bell bottoms look ridiculous, but in the 1970s, they didn't necessarily look ridiculous, because you got to understand the historical context, right? So to understand why people were wearing bell bottoms in the 70s and why people had big hair and shoulder pads in the 80s, you got to understand the context, the historical context, the era they were living in, right? To be sure, there's also an effect the other way, where individuals have an impact on the history of society, right? Indeed, the history of society is the story of individuals. So you got to understand not just the large level social patterns, you've also got to understand the small level interaction. And that's where we get into this idea of levels of analysis, right? So macro level is what we're talking about when we talk about these big picture views. That's macro level. Big picture, large level social patterns. I keep going back to that term, right? Micro are these individual things, right? It's about how people interpret interactions. Emotion is a very micro level thing to feel, but our emotions are so often impacted by our environment, by the people around us, by these larger social patterns, right? That's really where we get into this intersection between sociology and psychology, what we call social psychology. That really happens at the micro level, right? Social psychology is very much a micro level science. The macro level are these patterns that involve entire populations or entire sections of town. So I like to think of it kind of as a map, right? Think about Google Map. No, I'm not going to do it. Just think about we've all been on like Google Maps before, and they got the street view, right? You can zoom in, and then you can even look at the street view. So you can think of the levels of interaction and the connection between the two as like looking at a map of Greenville. If you're just looking like a map of Greenville, and you're seeing from the bird's eye perspective, from the zoomed out, the macro level perspective, you can see where all the neighborhoods are. And you can see why traffic patterns are happening in certain places. So you can see where the neighborhoods are, where people live. And then you could also see like where ECU is, where all the jobs are, by the hospital, where a lot of people work. And you can see traffic patterns between those suburban communities where that's all houses and where people live, and the urban job centers where lots of people work. And that's where you're seeing a whole lot of traffic, and you see the traffic jams and the traffic problems, right? So from the macro level perspective, you're seeing how these larger structures are impacting individual interaction and causing these traffic jams. Now, the micro level interaction is when you would focus in, you would zoom in on the street view, and then you could see the people stuck in traffic, and you see that it's having an emotional effect on people, right? You've heard of road rage, right? Like people get mad in traffic. It's frustrating. You're slowed down. It's just a stressful situation being stuck in traffic and having cars going everywhere. So these larger level patterns, right, where the jobs are, where people live, and the fact that people need to get from there to there at similar times in the day, that's what's causing this traffic jam. But the reason it matters and the reason it's worth studying is the effect that it's having on the individuals who are stuck in that traffic, right? It's having real effects. It's impacting their mood, which impacts their interaction. And that's the sociological imagination, right? The sociological imagination is seeing that person who's stuck in traffic is upset because they're stuck in traffic. Their temper is a little bit shorter because they just drove through Greenville right by the hospital at 5:30 in the afternoon. They're high. They're tense, right? The temper is a little bit shorter, right? Understanding that that's happening is the micro level perspective. Understanding why that's happened and how these larger levels traffic patterns are impacting these individual level emotions. That's the sociological perspective. It's not just saying that he's mad because he was stuck in traffic, but it's actually thinking about the overall traffic patterns and the way that the geography of that city has been put together. That's that larger level perspective that's having an impact on so many people's individual emotions and feelings and sentiments and their interactions and the way they behave. So it's not just seeing that, oh, he's upset because he's been in traffic. It's seeing that he's upset because he's been in traffic. And here's why traffic is. Here's why traffic exists and how traffic came to be such a problem in that area at that time in this day. So I hope that makes sense, right? So that's the sociological imagination, connecting the macro to the micro, not in the simplest terms, but really extricating as much information as you can in the history of how things got to that way and how that's affecting the individual. So it's not just that it's affecting the individual, not just seeing the social structures that affect the individual, but the history of how these social structures came into being and how they're still affecting individual emotions and interactions today. All right. So I get excited sometimes when I talk about this stuff because I'm a big sociology nerd. But that's what I got for you today. We're right at 30 minutes on this video, so that's about as far as I wanted to go with this introductory video. So anyway, again, I'm Tim. Thanks for being in sociology. I'm looking forward to this semester. Reach out to me anytime with any questions that you have. I will be happy to hear from you. and looking forward to the semester. Thanks, everybody.